Okay, this is a Bigfoot story. The man says it's true, and in his email, he tells me to call him Illinois boy. So let's read his story. This is pretty good. I live by a state park in eastern Illinois. One day I decided to saddle up my old donkey and take a nice long ride along some of the many trails the park has to offer. Darling is a pretty good old girl. Nothing really bothers her except water. I can urge her through it, but she lets me know that she ain't happy about it. We were heading down the trail and I was enjoying the changing colors of the leaves. Fall was extra pretty that year. It felt like the trees had an extra batch of leaves and every one of them was a different shade of red, brown, green, or yellow. I was paying more attention to the brilliant colors than I was to Darling when she started acting skittish. I don't know what was making her so jumpy. She never acted that way before, but I got her attention and we headed on down the trail. We hadn't gone much further when I heard something coming up behind us through the mass of fallen leaves. I twisted around to see what it was, but there was nothing there. It gave me an uneasy feeling, so I urged the old girl into a trot. Whatever was back there picked up its pace to match ours. So I stopped her, and whatever was back there stopped too, and then started again as soon as we did. Well, this went on for a quarter of a mile until I finally stopped and dismounted. Darling had her ears pointed straight forward and was snorting like she wasn't happy. Well, this prompted me to look a little harder at our surroundings, and that's when I saw it. Lurking behind a tree was a really big brown something that kept poking its head out for a quick glance at us before pulling back behind the tree. Well, in this part of Illinois, we don't have anything like bears. I've seen a couple of mountain lions, but this was way bigger than that. I guess he got tired of playing peekaboo with me because he finally walked out into the open. He was about the biggest animal I had ever seen in my life. He was 8 feet tall. He had no neck, and his shoulders were twice as broad as a football player's. His arms were long, going all the way down to his knees. Well, he just stood there, sort of swaying back and forth while I stood there staring at him until I got nervous and moved up toward Darling's head. I didn't know what to do, and I know Darling didn't know, so I put my foot in the stirrup and I climbed back up on her with every intention of beating a hasty retreat. Before I cued Darling to run, though, this thing caught my eye with a wave of its hand. It looked like it was motioning for me to come over to it. Well, I'm sorry, but I wasn't about to walk toward that thing. And then it started walking toward me and grunting. I didn't wait for it to get to us. I kicked Darling into a dead run. I thought we were going at a pretty good pace, until I looked back and I saw that this Bigfoot thing wasn't 40 feet behind us. We were coming up on a fork in the trail, so thinking quickly, I turned Darling down the side trail, and I was hoping we might throw it off a bit, at the very least gain some ground. It wasn't until it was too late to take the first path that I remembered that this one was going to lead us straight to a stream. With Darling's aversion to water, I figured this wasn't going to be good, but it was too late to turn back now. Taking that quick turn did seem to cross our pursuer up a bit. We gained another 10 feet on him. Darling was moving faster now than I'd ever known her to, but that stream was coming up fast, and visions of her slamming on her brakes and sending me over her head danced through my mind as I spurred her on to an even faster pace. I thought maybe if we approached the water fast enough, she'd get through it without too much trouble. But I could see the stream coming up and hear the Bigfoot closing in at the same time. And my heart was racing with fear and anticipation of the worst. We hit the water and Darling ran through it like she was half fish. The water churned white and sparkled in the sunlight under her hooves, and she acted like it was nothing. As we reached the opposite bank, I looked back and the Bigfoot was gone. Maybe all that water splashing startled him. Maybe he just gave up, I don't know. What I do know is that I owe that Bigfoot a debt of gratitude, because after that day, Darling never showed any fear of water again. Hey y'all, welcome to the Dixie Cryptid channel. My name's Cam Buckner, and I know people like my longer videos, but I am terribly busy at work. And so I'm getting out as many stories as I can with the time I have. However, with that being said, I've got 3 stories in this podcast, and I hope that'll suffice. I love you all, and I love doing these stories, but YouTube is not my main source of income. Matter of fact, it's a small source of income, and I gotta eat. If y'all have seen images of me on these videos, you know that I like to eat. But I'm real busy, and I'm trying to perform for my customers. I still have time to do a podcast. Matter of fact, I'm getting more podcasts out than I ever have. They're just a little bit shorter. What I do is I come in early and I record 1 or 2 stories. They're 5 or 10 minutes long. And I put them out just to let you know that I'm still reading stories and all. So you guys hang with me. This is just a season. It's a busy season. And by some miracle in this terrible economy, I have some pretty good work. So I'm very thankful for that. And I can still make a living, and that's what I'm trying to do. I have to support my family and pay my bills just like everybody else. And there haven't been too many people complain, but if you just be patient with me, I'll get back to longer podcasts before long. I kind of announced this about 2 or 3 weeks ago, and maybe people didn't hear me announce that the podcast would be shorter but more frequent. But that's what I'm doing. So I'm not complaining. I'm not. And I want to work on Steve Lilly, and I want to do all kind of stuff with this. But it just doesn't pay as much as my regular job, so I got to stay where the money's at. Okay, let's move on we got 2 more stories left in this podcast. They are both Bigfoot stories, and I think you're going to No, one's a paranormal story, and the other is a Bigfoot story. But they're really good, so hang with me. Thanks for joining me. All right, here we go. Okay, this story is a paranormal story. I don't know if it's true. I think it's probably not. But it's a damn good story, so you know the drill. Put that chin strap on your toupee. Glue your dentures in, because this is a good one. All right, let's get going with it. In 1985, I was traveling in the northwest part of Utah. I was dozing off behind the wheel, so I opted to pull into a no-tell motel for the night. After I flipped the mattress over for a quick bedbug check and searched the fixtures for video cameras, you never know about these out-of-the-way places, I flopped down on the bed. For whatever reason, I couldn't get the television to work, so I gave up and thumbed through a small stack of magazines on the nightstand. An article caught my eye about an old silver mining town. It stated that a theater company was willing to pay for new hires to serve as reenactors, portraying characters from the Old West for tourists. With visions of the movie Westworld in my head, I tore out the article and shoved it in my duffel bag. What did I care, I thought. Might be fun to step out of my boring life for a while to pretend to be someone else. After several weeks of phone calls and background checks, I was offered a job as a saloon faro dealer. When I arrived, I noted how exact a replica the place was of an Old West town. It was overrun with tourists, but you could easily tell who the workers were by their old-fashioned dress. Well, I was dressed for my part, looking like Hugh O'Brien's character in the John Wayne movie The Shootist. I tried to copy Hugh O'Brien's cocky arrogance, but thankfully, I never had to defend myself against any sore losers that lost at my faro table. The tourists thought my act was a hoot, and it was all in good fun. Once we closed, my other duties involved making the rounds and securing the place for the night. Late one evening, I decided to stay and enjoy the solitude of the mountains in the background and the starry skies above. I found myself back at the saloon with nothing to do, so I sat at my table and began to practice some new card moves. There was no smoking allowed on the premises, but the air began to fill with the smell of burning tobacco, and I thought my coworkers were pulling a joke or that a couple of stray tourists had trespassed onto the place after hours. There was a distinct sound of boot shuffling, as if a crowd of invisible line dancers had suddenly taken the floor. Well, my heart jumped into my mouth when a player piano roared into life and began pumping out a saloon-worthy rendition of Camptown Ladies. I found myself face to face with a trio of reenactors, one portraying a cowboy and two playing miners. They pulled out chairs at my table and they sat down. Well, I didn't recognize them. "When did you guys start working here?" I asked. "Are you going to deal the cards or just sit there?" one of the miners demanded. Someone is having a big laugh at my expense, I thought, so I played along and dealt the first hand. The three bellowed for drinks. An actress playing a pretty saloon girl who I didn't recognize brought over a tray and set it off to the side. The three men downed their booze in one gulp and turned their attention back to the game. By then the bar was filled, and every patron was dressed in period clothing, as was I. All night long the cowboy had been losing badly. He made a derogatory remark about my faro dealing skills. Thinking this was all play acting, I summoned my inner Hugh Bryan, and I told him, "You have two ways of leaving this establishment, my friend, immediately or dead." Like Hugh Bryan's character, I love watching a beaten man leave the room. The cowboy shuffled dejectedly across the bar and made his exit through the swinging doors. "Look out!" someone yelled a few seconds later as the entire place dove for cover. The cowboy reappeared in the doorway brandishing a gun. I heard his blank cartridge whiz by me as I instinctively raised my own gun and took him down with one shot to the heart. Well, a cheer went up throughout the bar as a couple of patrons dragged the cowboy's body out the exit. I holstered my pistol and continued the game. And in that moment, I really was Hugh Bryan, and all the characters in the saloon feared and respected me. I told the two actors playing the miners that I was shutting down the faro table for the night. They chose not to complain and passively made their way out the exit. I assumed the other staff in the bar, detracted by their partying, would close up, so I made my way out. And as my boots kicked up the dirt, I thought I saw someone sleeping on a bench in front of the general store. It was the cowboy I had pretended to shoot. "Wake up," I said, as I nudged him, except he wasn't asleep. I noted the dry blood across his chest. I turned and ran back to the saloon to summon help. I could hear the player piano, but as I entered, I saw the place was deserted. The gravity of the situation was dawning on me that I had just shot and killed a man in front of a saloon full of eyewitnesses who had suddenly vanished. I rushed back to the general store thinking I could still help the cowboy if it wasn't too late, but he had gone missing too. Had my fellow reenactors removed the body? I checked the blanks in my Colt and counted 5 still in the cylinder. There were 2 unaccounted for, mine and his. I searched every inch of that saloon and couldn't find neither. Had someone found the spent cartridges and taken those too? Somewhere in the panic it occurred to me that I was being pranked. You can't kill people across the room firing only blanks, and dead bodies don't go missing, and large groups of rowdy bar patrons don't disappear without a trace. The next day I took my coworkers to task, congratulating them on pulling off such an elaborate hoax. No one seemed to know what I was talking about. A few humored me enough to listen as I recounted the events from the night before. "You say you heard music coming from this piano?" asked one of them. He swept his hand down the keyboard, but the instrument produced no sound. "This piano doesn't have hammers," he continued. "It's a prop." Well, I shook my head. I was starting to feel somewhere between foolish and possibly insane. "You know, your character's based on a real guy," he added. I had assumed there was no history behind any of the people that we were supposed to be portraying. "Some cowboy drifter didn't like his cards, so he and the faro dealer got into it," continued the co-worker. "The faro dealer shot him dead. The next night, a gang of cowboys rode into town and took care of the faro dealer. You want to hang around and see what happens to your character tonight?" They all started laughing at my so-called ghost story. Real or imagined, I knew I was no Hugh O'Brien. It was boring old me that removed my gun belt and bid my farewells and got the hell out of Dodge. The writer of this email doesn't say whether to use her name or not, so I won't. Blah, blah, blah. You've heard that a million times, but here is what she wrote to me. My grandmother on my dad's side lived in a holler in West Virginia. My family and I live in Ohio, but we would go visit her from time to time over the years. It was like an adventure every time we visited. Grandma was fond of telling us a story of a time when she saw a face in the window. She described it as a large, hairy man she called Burper. Since my grandmother's house sat up on a hill and the window she was referring to easily sat 8 feet off the ground, we always laughed it off with a "Sure, Grandma." She was always telling us stories, so we figured this was another one for our entertainment. That was part of what was wonderful about my grandmother. She was always telling tales and spinning yarns for us, even if they were often the kind my mother would have preferred my sister and I not hear. That's why we assumed Burper was another one of Grandma's special stories. Years later, when I was an older teen, I went to visit my grandmother by myself. And by the time I struggled to get my bags up the hill to her house and got settled in, it had gotten late. I noticed that my grandmother seemed nervous, which was highly unusual for her. It got my attention, so I asked her what was wrong. She was reluctant to talk at first, but after some coaxing, she said that she'd been hearing noises in the woods at night, and then she added that she would rather I didn't go out there alone. Well, I did my best to assure her that it was nothing to worry about. "It's probably animals in the woods, Grandma," I said. Ignoring my explanation, she said, "If you wake up in the night and you have to go outside to use the outhouse, you wake me up and I'll go with you." Then she pointed to the big heavy silver flashlight that she kept by the door and added, "And we'll take the flashlight out with us." There was no doubt in my mind that I was going to have to go out to the outhouse at some point. My only other option was to use the bucket that she kept for nighttime emergencies, and I didn't think I could bring myself to do that. But I could see that she was serious, so I promised that I would wake her if I needed to go out. A week passed, during which I spent my time riding quads up and down the holler with the neighbors, wading the creek, and generally having a good time. I forgot all about my promise to my grandmother. It was a typical hot and sticky summer night. I was tossing and turning in the heat with no air conditioning when I realized I had to go to the bathroom. The bucket was in Grandma's room and I didn't want to wake her. Besides, I didn't really like using that bucket anyway. I slipped on my shoes and grabbed my flashlight, and I shut the door as quietly as I could behind me. Walking down that dark wooded path at 2 o'clock in the morning was creepy, but I had the flashlight, so I shined it up and down the path to make sure nothing was going to jump out at me. I wasn't actually scared until I heard a twig snap behind me. I stopped and I turned around to shine the light back down the path, but there was nothing there. Hearing noises in the woods set me on edge. And until that night, I had been using the bucket, so I felt a bit like I was in unfamiliar territory. I shined the light along the trees once more for reassurance and then continued on my way to the outhouse. And by the time I reached the door, I had to go so bad I didn't even latch it. The unpleasant odors had me holding back my breath, but all outhouses smell and the relief was worth it. Once I finished my business, I stood up to leave, but as I reached for the door, something slapped the side of the outhouse so hard that it shook. I froze in fear for a second before reaching up and locking the door, and then I held on to the handle as if my life depended on it. And at that moment, I was pretty sure it did depend on it. Another slap shook the little building again as I clutched the handle tighter, and I screamed at the top of my lungs. I was more terrified than I had ever been in my life. I was sobbing hysterically now as another slap, this time at the top of the door where the screen was, and it rattled the door terribly. I looked up in time to see a big hairy arm tear through it. I grabbed the flashlight and began hitting the arm over and over with all my strength, screaming as loud as I could the whole time. There was a howl of pain and heavy breathing, and then the thing must have run back into the woods. I slid down onto the floor, terrified and stunned, but too afraid to leave. I sat there on the outhouse floor the whole night with my shirt sleeve through the handle and the flashlight cradled in my arm. At some point, I fell asleep. The next morning, I was awakened to the feeling of someone trying to open the door and the sound of my name being called. It was my grandmother, and when I opened the door, she kneeled down and she hugged me while I cried. I'll never forget that comforting hug as long as I live. Grandma is no longer with us, but she was the kind of person you never forget. And now I know that her stories about the burper were true. All right, thanks for listening. I hope you guys enjoyed those 3 stories. I'll probably be back tomorrow with a short one. I think I've got 4 videos already done. I'll drop probably 4 in the next 4 to 6 days. So we'll keep the stories coming. They're just going to be a little shorter for the time being. Again, before long, they'll get longer. I appreciate you hanging with me. Thank you all.